B-R-A-Z-E-N.
I remember being there when we were all sitting in the office going, what do you mean, the Beach Boys? How much more American can you get on the 4th of July than the Beach Boys?
It's 1983, and the Beach Boys are preparing to play a free concert on the Mall in Washington, D.C. to celebrate July 4th. But there's a problem. U.S. Interior Secretary James Watt, who has oversight over federal lands and parks, has just made a startling announcement.
James Watt, for whatever reasons, decided that these rock and roll bands that attract drugs and a really bad element should not go and play on the 4th of July in front of the Washington Monument.
On tour in Canada with John Meglen, their promoter, the band has just heard that they're banned from playing July 4th in the nation's capital. And they're pissed.
Carl was always sensitive. Mike, of course, revolted. Al revolted. Dennis revolted. We had spent so much time tagging them America's band.
The early 1980s were a time of teeth gnashing over drugs and the negative influence of hard rock music on youth culture. But the Beach Boys, with their California surfer vibe, were hardly Ozzy Osbourne. Hearing of his Interior Secretary's actions, President Reagan and his wife Nancy, fellow Californians, would soon come to the rescue. And the Beach Boys, always PR savvy, would turn this negative publicity into an opportunity to mount a comeback. I'm Tom Wright, an author and podcaster.
I'm Adam Wilkes, a concert promoter. And this is Night of Show.
We met John Meglen, Adam's colleague, back in episode 1, when he helped Prince get back on top in 2007. But John got his start as a young promoter in the 1980s, with bands like the Beach Boys.
Well, at that time in the early 80s, I was just a young gun like a lot of others in the company. And I think in the early 80s, at a point, I was assigned to work on the Beach Boys. There were certain gigs, if you got assigned to, you're like, oh, fuck, I got the Beach Boys. You know, if you got a Neil Diamond tour, those were Cadillac tours, okay? If you got a Dylan tour, that really sucked. Because, like, one tour, he stayed in youth hostels.
And with the Beach Boys, was it just, you guys just had such a hustle, right? You're doing 2 shows a day, you're doing 5 shows in 3 days.
We were a machine on the road. We would base out of a city, like we stay up at the Sagamore on Lake George, New York. And then we would have a couple of Learjets and we'd go down to the Glen Falls Airport, because you couldn't land a big jet there. That's all you could land with little jets. And we'd fly out and play an afternoon somewhere, and then an evening somewhere, come back.
Even though the Beach Boys in the early 1980s was still a popular act, they often played small venues, unlike the superstars of today.
I mean, they would literally, there were times where we would be circling a state fair, trying to use a walkie-talkie from the airplane, trying to find out if the opening act was off the stage yet. Because we wanted to land, get right to the venue. They would go on the stage. As soon as they come off the stage, we go straight into the cars, back to the plane, fly to the next city, do it again, and then fly back to where we were staying. We didn't hang out. We just like did the show, got out of there, went to the next city, did the show, got out of there, went back to the base hotel.
You don't hear about bands touring like that anymore, especially like superstars like that. What was it just unique to them?
The thing about the Beach Boys, I mean, maybe you could say that Jimmy Buffett had that vibe later. But the fact is, they created a whole style, a whole culture.
You could call that culture Endless Summer. And it went back to 1961 when the band was formed in Hawthorne, California. The original lineup consisted of brothers Brian, Dennis, and Carl Wilson, their cousin, Mike Love, and friend, Al Jardine. The group's first national hit, Surfing USA, came 2 years later, followed by a string of top 10 singles that created what became known as the California sound. By 1983, however, the Beach Boys had long since transitioned to an oldies act, traveling the country incessantly. They hadn't had a number one hit for 17 years.
The 80s, the Beach Boys just were not on top of the world like they were in the 1960s. You have no idea what it's like to go to Edmonton, Canada in the middle of the winter, and the local guy has put sand all over the floor of the arena so they could have a winter beach party. And people would check their coats at the door and go in and play on the beach in the middle of the winter. It was such it to this day is. It created a cultural phenomenon regarding California summers.
Behind the scenes, the band wasn't so laid back. Brian Wilson, a musical genius, and his brother Dennis, the band's drummer, were battling drug addiction and mental illness. Dennis and Mike Love, the clean living lead singer, who preferred meditation to drugs, had even taken out restraining orders against one another. But the band remained popular, and Mike Love, by then the de facto leader, had planned a way to put them back in the national spotlight.
It happened to be during the time period that the Beach Boys did their famous 4th of July concerts at the Washington Memorial in Washington, D.C.
The first of these July 4th concerts in 1980 had attracted 500,000 people. It was broadcast on FM radio around the country as the group brought their signature nostalgic surf rock to the nation's capital. The concert became an HBO special, and the Beach Boys returned to the mall to play July the 4th the next year. The Grassroots, riding a wave of interest in 60s oldies acts, also played July 4th on the mall in 1982. And that's where the trouble started.
Many of you may be thinking, well, drugs don't concern me, but it does concern you. It concerns us all because of the way it tears at our lives. Say yes to your life. And when it comes to drugs and alcohol, just say no.
In the 1980s, as Asian heroin poured onto the streets of America's cities, Nancy Reagan famously launched her Just Say No campaign. It was a time of deep concern about drugs, partly real and partly fanned by fear over youth and urban culture. Joyce Nalepka was director of the National Federation of Parents for a Drug-Free Youth, which was chaired by Nancy Reagan. In 1982, she and her family went to the mall to watch the July 4th party, where they happened upon the Grassroots concert. In an interview, Joyce later said her 6-year-old kid had witnessed drug abuse, alcohol, and mud wrestling, and so they left. A couple of months later, Joyce bumped into the wife of Reagan's Interior Secretary, James Watt, whom she told about the incident. Forgotten now, Watt was one of those 1980s political figures, almost a caricature of the era.
He was a weird-looking dude, by the way. I think he was like bald-headed, had the kind of the brown square glasses.
Then in his mid-40s, Watt was a rapacious capitalist who handed over acres of federal land for coal mining and oil drilling. He was also known for making sexist and racist remarks, even as he moralized about wayward youth. These kinds of figures were starting to look like dinosaurs, even in the 1980s. And Watt was the butt of many jokes, like this SNL sketch.
Morning, Secretary Watt.
Oh, boy. I am a jackass, I tell you. Every time I open my mouth, someone gets mad. Everybody hates me. Why?
It wasn't long before Watt gave an interview to the Washington Post saying he was banning rock bands from the July 4th celebration on the mall. Watt claimed he wanted to stop, and I quote, the wrong element from attending. Instead, for the 1983 concert, he arranged for, quote, patriotic, family-based entertainment, end quote, to be provided by the U.S. Army Blues Band and Las Vegas crooner Wayne Newton.
I believe James Watt, when he made his declaration of none of these rock bands like the Beach Boys should be playing on the 4th of July, part of his statement was that they attract the drug culture and bad people. So I don't know if he was trying to, maybe he thought he would please Nancy Reagan when she was starting her Just Say No program by doing that, but it totally backfired on him.
When the story hit the pages of the Washington Post, other media jumped on it.
Interior Secretary James Watt, well known for his controversial views on land and water use, today expressed some strong views on rock use. Not the quarry kind, but the 4th of July concert on the Mall kind. It's what some rock fans are calling the unkindest cut of all.
One radio station called the Beach Boys, who were then on tour in Canada, for comment. Bruce Johnston, the band's keyboardist, later told an interviewer what Mike Love had said to the reporter.
He said, you know, they should drill James Watt's ass for brains.
Watt's decision to paint the Beach Boys as dangerous radicals was hilarious. Okay, some members took drugs, and Dennis Wilson had spent time in the 1960s with the Manson family. But the band was more conservative than anything. Mike Love, in particular, was a huge Reagan fan, and the band had played at his inaugural ball. In the 1980s, Love even helped finance the Parents Music Resource Center, the group behind the parental advisory stickers on albums and CDs deemed to promote sex, violence, or drugs. Watt should have been celebrating the band, not banning it. The backlash was immediate.
In fact, it started, I believe, with George Bush and his wife.
The vice president put out what must be one of the weirdest ever White House statements, and I quote, "They're my friends, and I like their music." Student groups who hated conservative figures like Watt found themselves in rare agreement with the White House.
It seems a shame that Mr. Watt cannot stick to his self-appointed task of destroying the environment without having to bring musical bigotry into the bargain.
It was Reagan, though, who felt most let down. Trashing the environment was fine, but the Beach Boys...
To insult the Beach Boys, what James Watt did, is insulting the Reagans. I don't know if you get much more American than Ronald and Nancy Reagan, and you don't get much more American than the Beach Boys.
In a speech, President Reagan decided to make light of the situation, saying he was bringing in his special envoy to the Middle East to diffuse tensions.
I've just called in Ambassador Phil Habib to settle the Jim Watt Beach Boy controversy.
Reagan then ordered Watt to the Oval Office, where he gave him a plaster statue of a foot.
Well, Ronald Reagan ended up awarding him with a plaster boot with a hole in the front of the boot, signifying, the shoot yourself in the foot award.
And then Reagan forced Watt to walk out of the West Wing, foot statue in hand, to meet the press.
This is shooting yourself in the foot.
And where did you get it from?
The president handed it to me.
By way of an apology, 2 months later, the Reagans invited the Beach Boys to play a special Olympics benefit on the South Lawn of the White House. Dressed in tight shorts, polo shirts, and tennis socks, the Beach Boys were warm and solicitous towards the First Family and their guests. The whole atmosphere felt buddy-buddy, as the audience, filled with 80s stars, was urged by Mike Love to join in and sing along with the band.
A little louder from this side. Gotta keep those loving good vibrations.
After the performance, Ronald and Nancy Reagan came up on stage.
We were looking forward to seeing them on the 4th of July.
As the president spoke, Mike Love hugged Nancy.
And if you didn't believe that our whole family have been fans of yours for a long time, just look at Nancy.
But it was too late to change the plans for July 4th. The Beach Boys were committed elsewhere. The next month, as the crowds gathered on the Mall, it began to rain. As Wayne Newton took the stage, many in the audience began to jeer.
One or two of you that might be booing may as well go home, because we're going to have a hell of a good time without you.
As for James Watt, his career was all but over. He tried to backpedal, telling an interviewer that he'd never even mentioned the Beach Boys. In fact, Watt claimed he'd never even heard of the band, and it had all been a big misunderstanding. 2 months later, while making a speech, Watt drove the final nail into his own coffin. Discussing the members of a new board under his supervision, Watt mocked affirmative action. And I quote, "I have a black, a woman, 2 Jews, and a cripple," end quote. Amid the outcry, Watt submitted his resignation. He's still alive, aged 85, but we couldn't get hold of him. This, however, is not the end of our story. As they say, there's no such thing as bad publicity. And no one understood this better than Mike Love.
That's why the thing became as big as it did. I think he was on Nightline or a bunch of those things. So Mike did not shy away from the press at all. And he would, in his Mike Love way, which is never yelling, but Mike had a way of intimidating people with just his language.
As Mike Love took to the TV circuit, the Beach Boys were on everyone's lips again, John remembers.
We could see the results in ticket sales. It made him hot again. You know, you're always looking for those little surges of adrenaline, surges of something that can catch on, that will be a hook.
The next year, 1984, the band was back on the Mall for July 4th, accompanied by Ringo Starr on drums. The crowd, at 750,000 people, was double the number that had turned out for Wayne Newton. For the next year's July 4th party, 80s icon Mr. T from the A-Team television show, also a big supporter of Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign, played drums for the Beach Boys.
All I remember was Mr. T kept yapping and yapping and yapping. And Carl Wilson, bless his soul, just got up, turned around and said, "Would you shut the fuck up?" And everybody applauded.
The Beach Boys were back in the limelight. Even Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, considered one of the best guitarists of all time, joined the band on stage in 1985.
The Beach Boys with special guest Jimmy Page.
What was crazy about it, it was really kind of the first appearance of Jimmy Page since Led Zeppelin. And I just remember standing on the side of the stage, and when they announced Jimmy Page and he walked out, you could literally feel the ground shake.
The next year, the Beach Boys played on the USS Iowa battleship in New York Harbor for the centenary of the Statue of Liberty, which had just been renovated.
Who's sitting on top of the USS battleship Iowa unveiling the Statue of Liberty? Who's playing the music? The Beach Boys.
And then, in 1988, the band released Kokomo from the soundtrack to the Tom Cruise movie Cocktail. It was their first #1 since Good Vibrations, 22 years earlier. But all this success masked a growing turmoil. By then, Brian Wilson was gone.
Why did Brian leave the band at that time?
He wasn't healthy. He needed, get his head together, I guess you'd say, and all of that. Brian was never comfortable touring anyway. I don't know. Maybe he'd rather write songs in his room.
Dennis Wilson, too, was gone. He drowned while swimming off a boat at Marina del Rey in Los Angeles. He was found with drugs and alcohol in his system.
You could talk about the Beach Boys and say they're America's band. They had all their issues like every other American family does.
After the White House concert in 1983, Reagan had told the Beach Boys to call him if they ever needed anything. So now, Dennis's family pulled in the favor. His wife wanted a burial at sea for the only member of the Beach Boys who actually served. And Reagan personally helped make arrangements with the Coast Guard. It was a fitting tribute for a member of a band that the Reagans had loved and supported.
You're talking about a California couple, and they grew up loving the Beach Boys like the rest of us.
We want to hear from you. Perhaps you experienced a life-changing moment at a concert or meeting one of your favorite artists. Send us your best stories via voice message at nightofshow.com/contact. That's nightofshow.com/contact. We'll include the best of them on future episodes, and you stand to win Night of Show merch, also available on the show's website, nightofshow.com. Thanks for listening. Night of Show is a production of Project Brazen in partnership with PRX. It's written and presented by me, Tom Wright, and Adam Wilkes. The executive producers are Adam Wilkes, Paul Gongaware, John Meglen, Tom Wright, and Bradley Hope. Sandy Smollins is the executive producer for Audiation. The story editor is Joe Levy. Mariangel Gonzalez is senior producer. Matthew Rubenstein is the producer. Edited and mixed by Tom Sullivan and Paul Vitolins at Audiography. Original music by Paul Vitolins, with additional music by Tom Sullivan. Theme music by William Whitman. Lucy Woods is head of research. Ryan Ho is the creative designer for the project, with cover art design by Julien Pradier. Clearance counsel is Inez Smolansky, Esquire.
Audiation.